Hello, hi. Sorry, I and bad connection. Back again. Um, Hi everybody. Apologies that this is so late. It is so lovely to be back and so lovely to be discussing this incredible book. Connection. It's going to be fine. This connection. Anyway, I hope we can keep getting through this. This was such a special book, and I'm wearing Choose Love t-shirt for a reason, because Choose Love is a charity that specializes in helping refugees, and especially at Christmas or any time of the year, you can buy gifts, which are bundles that go to help refugees. You can buy either it's things like a warm coat or a tent or things for babies and all these bundles, and they can be a gift for somebody in your life. Or you can just go and buy cool merchandise like this. They've got the great t-shirts or hoodies or anything, and all that money goes to helping and supporting refugees. And, I think this is such an important issue in our time right now. I quickly went on the United Nations Refugee Agency page, and to start this off, just to show you sort of about the universality of this problem. These are the emergencies. These aren't, crisis, or these aren't places that are problems. These are just the emergencies, places that the United Nations Refugee Agency has deemed an emergency. Ethiopia, Tigray, Burundi, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, displacement in Central America, Iraq, Nigeria, Rohingya, Sahel, South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, and on top of all of that, the COVID crisis. So I thought that this book was very, very timely and very, very important for all of us to read. And I think, reading most of your comments and everything, I think the majority of you loved it. And I just think it's such a lesson in empathy and such an insight into the humanity of the people who are thrown into these horrific decisions about whether they have to leave their home in search of safety and a better life. So with that, let's get on to talking about Saeed and Nadia and this beautiful, beautiful book. I've picked out 10 questions that you've all posted, and I'm going to flip between them and do a little bit of reading too, because I just think the language and the way he writes is so beautiful. One of the first questions, and this is from, and I'm going to butcher all of these names, is Cidiane Manning. And her question is about the use of the magic doors. And this is one of the sort of tools or one of the tricks that Moshin used that I just loved. And I thought it had such an impact and a power. The talk of these rumors of magic doors, and why do I think that Hamid used this metaphor? And I think that it feeds into the feeling of this story, and this is something that I immediately sort of felt that I was in, of it being like a parable or a fable. That idea of this like friendly, kind narrator who was sitting back and telling us this story that is very important for us all to know. And, it sort of had, the way, I keep just mixing up whether I'm going to call him Moshin or Hamid. But the way, his ability to sort of write from a distance as this narrator and give us this sort of sense of, at the same time being removed from the story, but then also being able to make it so intimate. And so, the way I connected with Saeed and Nadia, and that felt so close and so intimate, and I didn't feel like I lost anything of their inner worlds, but yet at the same time it was able to be at a little bit of a remove. It was a very deft, the way he was able to do it, it was very skillful as a writer, and I just loved that kind of way that he wrote that. But getting to this idea of the magic doors, I think in this time that we're in, especially, in Europe, right now with the crisis of the refugee crisis and the migrant crisis, coming from Syria, Yemen, coming from North Africa, and what we've seen in Greece and what we've seen in France and in Italy and in the UK, and the language of the politicians that use these sort of journeys as condemnation of the people who are trying to come for better life. And I think by removing this sort of, the minutiae is the wrong word, because it's not, and those journeys are horrific, and anyone who makes them knows the horrific kind of risk that they're taking, and I'm not diminishing that at all. But I think by removing it, what it does is remove this idea of the rhetoric about walls, the rhetoric about borders, the rhetoric about, protecting our coastlines, and all of these things that has happened over the last few years, where politicians constantly try and use these sort of breaches of what they see law to basically other the migrants. And I think this idea of magic doors, of this idea that, of course, you just want someone to get from a place that is unsafe, a place that is, not free, a place where they have no prospects, to a place where they can thrive. And that's all anybody wants. That's all anyone would do. If war came to this country, if war came to anywhere else where people kind of live in this very privileged bubble where they think that they're somehow better than people who have to struggle to get here, they would be the first people trying to get out of here and go to somewhere safer. So I think this sort of beautiful idea of these magic doors, and it also, in a way, it's like there is this kind of dreamlike or nightmare-like quality of, and this is what I thought was so beautiful about how we get such an insight into their life before. And they lived a beautiful life and a productive life and a full life. And then all of a sudden your world comes crashing down. I wrote so many notes and now I'm just rambling. But I thought it was such a very smart way of keeping the larger picture at the front of this story, and not kind of having to get bogged down in all of the different ways that people have to travel. And again, and I say that in no way diminishing it. I think that that's a different story, and that's a different issue in a weird way. But yeah, I just thought it was a really powerful way, and it kept it in that kind of parable world for me. And I had such a beautiful, kind, old voice in my head telling me this story, and, the beauty of it and the pain of it. And, you just sort of flowed along with it, and you just wanted to hear more and more. And it's like every night when I would go to sleep before I'd finish, I'd sort of like, I don't want to stop listening to this. So that's how I feel about the doors. And thank you, C.D. Ann Manning. So we will move on. Oh, and lots of people talked about that as well and commented about this. And S.T. Santila also wrote some beautiful words. I'm having to write everything out. I'm not in my own home, so I don't have a printer and stuff. So it's lots of writing and notes. So I don't have I didn't have the time to write down everything everybody said. So the second question, Jill Mill wanted to ask, what did I think of Saeed and Nadia leaving each other without so much as a hug? It was such a sad realization when I sort of realized that they weren't going to stay together. But then it was also very hopeful, because it wasn't like they hurt each other or they turned on each other. Although obviously it wasn't perfect and they sort of lost their ability to communicate with each other. But it felt like, in a weird way, they outgrew each other, that they had bound their lives together to be safe, to help each other, to escape together, to be each other's protectors and anchor and get through this horrific thing. And then when they got to Marin, it was almost like as soon as there was a little bit of safety, as soon as there was a chance for them both to breathe and imagine a future, because up until this point there wasn't anything, they were the only thing that each other had. But all of a sudden there was this ability to contemplate another life, and what is it that they want? They escaped, but for what? Because up until this point they were just surviving, and this was the one point where they were given this sort of opening to actually live. And they realized that I think they both wanted to go in a different way. And the fact that they couldn't hug, to me, was because I think it was just so painful for both of them, that they had so much love still left for each other and so much care, but they knew that their paths were now in different directions, and that was the inevitability of life and how difficult that is, but also essential, and that you did get the sense that they were both going on to be happier, and that was a good thing. And maybe they represented too much struggle and too much pain for each other, that what they had gone through and all that hardship they'd experienced, they would always carry that together as a unit. And so in some ways they would have to break free to sort of let go of that and let go of the past. So it's brutal, though. I think, when you're reading it and you've rooted for the two of them so long as a couple, and you see how they keep missing each other on an emotional level, and especially when they communicate or not communicate at this point, and you want them to be able to just let go of all of that baggage that they've accumulated over the last few years. But I think it's too much for them to bear together. So anyway, it was very sad. I did shed a tear. I'm trying to think what else I had said. I write it all down, and I'm like, I'll read it out, and then it'll be all very succinct and clear. And then I just like to ramble. I think I've covered it. I'm going to go and read, this is going back to the Doors, and I'm going to read a passage from page 69. The effect doors had on people altered as well. Rumours began to circulate of doors that could take you elsewhere, often to places far away, well removed from this death trap of a country. Some people claimed to know people who knew people who had been through such doors. A normal door, they said, could become a special door, and it could happen without warning to any door at all. Most people thought these rumours to be nonsense and the superstitions of the feeble-minded, but some people began to gaze at their own doors a little differently nonetheless. Nadia and Saeed too discussed these rumours and dismissed them, but every morning when she woke, Nadia looked over at her front door and at the doors to her bathroom, her closet, her terrace, and every morning in his room, Saeed did much the same. All their doors remained simple doors, on-off switches in the flow between two adjacent places, binarily either open or closed. But each of their doors, regarded thus with a twinge of irrational possibility, became partially animate as well, an object with a subtle power to mock the desires of those who desired to go far away, whispering silently from its doorframe that such dreams were the dreams of fools. And that's pretty beautiful. And I think that's also taking this very simple idea of, I guess, the permission of movement. You know, a door is a very simple thing. You move from one room to another, and often that can be the simplest thing, but if you don't have permission, if somebody has decided that you can't use that door, and I guess that's what we're talking about, we have become a planet of nations and borders and ownership, and people have decided who gets to go where. You know, I'm a person who is an immigrant. I have lived in many other countries from the country I was born in. I've been very privileged because I guess I'm deemed the correct type of immigrant. I'm white. I come from, at least now, a wealthy country. Less so when it was in my parents' generation. I mean, the Irish then, even though there was huge immigration during that time, were not welcomed and were treated very similarly to how a lot of immigrants who are from the not correct countries now are treated. And I guess, you know, growing up as an Irish person, you're always so aware of immigration and migration, and it's part of our nation's story. And I guess that's what also makes me so devastated by how we who are, you know, part of these wealthy nations have now treated other people coming this way. Because it won't always, you know, we can't always predict where the next crisis is going to come from. You know, especially with the climate crisis happening right now, this problem is only going to get worse and worse because our climate is going to affect how people can survive on land. Our sea levels are going to rise. That is going to affect where people can live. And yet nobody in power really wants to have an empathetic or a really real discussion about what we're going to do. Yeah, it's that's why I loved this book so much. Anyway, let's move on to the next question, which is from Lynn's Retired. And she said, her question I thought was really interesting, but she said, one of the author's statements struck me. And this is the statement. It has been said that depression is one's failure to imagine a plausible and desirable future for oneself. She asked what my thoughts were. Sorry, my voice is still... And The one thing that I would say about that statement is I have one major disagreement with it, and that's with the word failure. I think the statement can be true if that was changed to inability, because failure makes it sound like that. We're back. Failure makes it sound like that this is somehow damn connection. To say failure makes it sound like somehow it's a choice, that there is a choice of whether you desire or whether you can imagine a plausible or desirable future. And I don't think that that's true. I think that due to someone's chemical composition in your mind or circumstantial, that you may have an inability to imagine the future. But I think it's right. I think if you don't, like, for me, the opposite of depression is having hope, or the opposite of hope or the absence of hope is depression. But I don't think I don't think hope, and I'm back. I don't think hope is always a choice, but I think if you can find ways to hope, then that gives you a possibility of getting out of this dark hole that you're in. And I think we were on such a good roll for a while. This damn connection. We're back. Right. I got so distracted by that damn connection. But yeah, and I think that this is something that obviously people who find themselves in these situations, I mean, if you land in a refugee camp and you have no idea when you're going to get out. I love technology. Why is my connection bonkers? I would love to know that too. I don't know why. But yeah, I can't even imagine how difficult it must be not to fall into despair. And I think that that's when you talk or you hear people who work with refugees and who work with people who've been displaced, that the mental health issues are just so difficult on top of everything else, is because they don't have that ability to hope, because they don't know how they're going to get out. I mean, we had a situation in Ireland recently where a really horrible situation in the county that I grew up in, where a young man commits suicide in one of these sort of refugee detention centres where they're being kept to give them shelter, but they have nothing else. They're being kept in these remote places with no ability to work or learn, or there's nothing to give them. There's no life, and I understand, yes, governments have a tough time, and they, we try to bring people in, and where do you house them, and what do you do, and while they're waiting for their asylum papers to go through or whatever, you can't just let them out into the community, or can you? But surely there has to be a better way of giving people dignity and giving them something to do. And if you think about all of the social problems or the infrastructure problems or whatever, why not give them a job or give them an opportunity while they're waiting? I just don't really understand this idea that if you're putting a roof over someone's head, that's all you have to do. That is not life. I mean, yes, it's better than sleeping rough, but it's it's a very sad situation that I think we all need to, educate ourselves about, and talk loudly, and maybe, hit up our politicians and say, we have to do this in a different way. Okay, moving on. This is so Deb DJM or DJWU actually. Deb Drew. I don't know. Deb wants to know my thoughts on Nadia's robe protected her true self from societal or cultural expectations. And I thought this was really interesting, the device of Nadia wearing the robe, and even though she wasn't religious, and yet it has such religious connotations, but she wore it as protection. And you know, obviously I'm not Muslim, and I didn't grow up in a Muslim country, so I'm going to make assumptions, but from even what Mosheen wrote about the need woman, this is not annoying at all, that for her, even though to us a lot of the time a burqa or these dark robes signify sort of like a stripping away of a woman's individualism, or just her agency or her freedom. For Nadia, this was actually protective, and it gave her more freedom, and it gave her an ability to move about and do what she wanted and live as a single woman without causing attention and without getting unwanted attention. And I thought that was really interesting, and then really, really interesting that she kept wearing it after they moved from place to place. And it made me wonder whether that was still a choice for her, or if she just couldn't let go of that fear of, what if I don't have this protective barrier around me against the world? What would happen to me? I'm going to read just a little bit sort of from earlier on about sort of why she wore it, or on the street the day before Nadia's shrooms arrived, there was a burly man at the red light of a deserted lake. And when she ignored him, began to swear at her, saying only a whore would drive a motorcycle. Didn't she know it was obscene for a woman to straddle a bike in that way? Had she ever seen anyone else doing it? Who did she think she was? And swearing with such a ferocity that she thought he might attack her. As she stood her ground, looking at him, visor down, heart pounding, but with her grip firm on the clutch and throttle, her hands ready to speed her away, surely faster than he could follow on his tired-looking scooter, until he shook his head and drove off with a shout, a sort of strangled scream, a sound that could have been rage or equally could have been anguish. You know, I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it was also really interesting as a way to highlight the difference between how really different between the way that Saeed could navigate his world and the way Nadia had to. Like, Saeed could be very secular, could live a very kind of secular life, even though he didn't live his life in an outwardly religious way, and he was free to do that, and he was free to be whatever he wanted and take whatever he wanted from his religion. But for Nadia, if she were to live outwardly as a secular woman, especially as a single woman, she would have come across, like, just encountered so much, I mean, possibly violence, definitely abuse. And it's just, it was I just thought it was a really powerful image as well, this idea of this woman having to wear this cloak to protect herself, or this robe to protect herself. Is this connection annoying anyone else? No? Is it getting too bad? I mean, I know it's going in and out, but somebody's like, maybe I should pause it and come back another day. I don't know. What do you think? We'll try and soldier on. Maybe we'll get a good so Vic Mitra, also want to talk about this sort of 5B. Nadia's experiences during her first months as a single woman living alone. And is it something I identified with? And have I ever experienced stuff like that? Well, I mean, you know, I moved. I don't know. Okay. We're going to soldier on. For fuck's sake. When I was just going to try something. It's just getting worse. I don't know what's going on. I remember living in Paris and being alone and coming across so many instances where I was flashed, I was grabbed, I was followed, spat at. Yeah, a lot of that stuff. And I think it's funny, I was just reading an article today about, and I'm forgetting her name, but the person who just wrote and directed A Promising Young Woman, which I'm dying to see. Love Carey Mulligan, and it's the writer, it's not Phoebe Waller-Bridge, but it's the other writer from Killing Eve. And she was talking about how the genesis of Promising Young Woman was that they were at a dinner party in London, her and her friends, one night, and one of the girls had come in and was just talking about this horrible incident she just had with a man on the street. And all the guys in the room were like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And all the women were like, what are you talking about? This shit happens all the time. And the men were so shocked. And then the women just went into this litany of stuff that happens to them on a daily basis. And, you know, it's funny. In many ways, like, you learn to take these things in your stride. But when you think back on it, you know, some horrible situations and some really, really scary and terrified. And, you know, I think me and all my friends had a thing where we would all walk home with our keys between our hands. Not like I could do any damage to anybody with keys sticking out between my knuckles, but, you know, the difference between like having to experience all that or being subjected to all of that and supposedly living in a very equal society. I can't even imagine what it's like when you live in a much less equal society where, you know, as a woman, your rights are, you know, non-existent. You're a second-class citizen, and pretty much if a man wants to do something to you, well then it's within his right, you know. You know, I think in Pakistan this week there's been some landmark laws being passed to force authorities to prosecute rapes and to bring people to justice. And I think that's happened after a national outcry of some horrible I think it was, I'm not sure if it was an attack or a murder and a violent sexual assault of a woman whose car had broken down, or two women who were in a car and their car had broken down. You know, and as a world, as a society, we have so much work to do. We have still so much work to do. We have so much work to do on our internet still. Let's move on. shall we? So this question came from, and she wanted me to read a couple of passages. So I am going to, first of all, read from page 197. If only, the connection. Are we back? Okay. This is really powerful. This is about the idea of natives and who's native and who isn't. And I just thought this was so just very beautifully put. In Marin, there were almost no natives, these people having died out or being exterminated long ago, and one would see them only occasionally at impromptu trading posts, or perhaps more often but wrapped in clothes and guises and behaviours indistinguishable from anyone else. At the trading posts they would sell beautiful silver jewellery and soft leather garments and colourful textiles, and the elders among them seemed not infrequently to be possessed of a limitless patience that was matched by a limitless sorrow. Tales were told at these places that people from all over now gathered to hear, for the tale of these natives felt appropriate to this time of migration and gave listeners much needed sustenance. And yet it was not quite true to say there were almost no natives, nativeness being a relative matter, and many others considered themselves native to this country, by which they meant that they or their grandparents, or their parents or their grandparents, or the grandparents of their grandparents had been born on the strip of land that stretched from the mid-North Pacific to the mid-Northern Atlantic, that their existence here did not owe anything to a physical migration that had occurred in their lifetimes. It seemed to Said that the people who advocated this position most strongly, who claimed the rights of nativeness most forcefully, tended to be drawn from the ranks of those with light skin who looked most like the natives of Britain. And as had been the case with many of the natives of Britain, many of these people too seemed stunned by what was happening to their homeland, what had already happened in so brief a period, and some seemed angry as well. A third layer of nativeness was composed of those who others thought directly descended, even in the tiniest fraction of their genes, from the human beings who had been brought from Africa to this continent centuries ago as slaves. While this layer of nativeness was not vast in proportion to the rest, it had vast importance, for society had been shaped in reaction to it, and unspeakable violence had occurred in relation to it, and yet a stratum of soil that perhaps made possible all future transplanted soils, and to which Said in particular was attracted, since at a place of worship which he had gone one Friday, the communal prayer was led by a man who had come from this tradition and spoke of this tradition, and Said had found, in the weeks he and Nadia had been in Marin, this man's words to be full of soul-soothing wisdom. That's pretty damn powerful, and especially in this time when, so many people in America are talking about borders and who has the right to come in and who doesn't have the right to come in, and some of them are only first-generation American, whose mother came from Scotland, whose wife is an immigrant, whose wife's parents came in. That hypocrisy and that lack of empathy and that kind of, it's okay for me because I am this, but this other. And that's the thing, what they do is they strip people of their humanity and they strip people of their stories and they make them a statistic or a thing to be feared or an other. And that we have let that kind of language, that we have let that kind of rhetoric back into our daily politics on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, I'm not just saying it happens in America, it happens here in the UK. I know it happens in France. I know it happens in many countries in Europe. But that we allow that is a stain on all of us, because these are just people. We're all people, you know. No one deserves a right to live or a right to strive more than anyone else. Okay, I'm going to read one other. We've got a little bit left. I think I've got a couple of questions, and I want to read this other one passage. Actually, maybe I'll go to a question first, and then. So Laura Axelvim, I butcher these handle names so badly. The city where Nadia and Saeed live, and from which they flee, has no name, and it is the only unnamed location in the book. What do you think of that? Well, I thought that was very clever and possibly, you know, it just shows the universality of this issue. And maybe it's a city in Syria, but maybe it's a city in Yemen, or maybe it could be anywhere. You know, when I was growing up, I remember the Yugoslavian war. You know, when Yugoslavia were, you know, and before that had happened, those were normal cities with people walking around, living their everyday life. And then boom, all of a sudden, it's a war zone and people are on the move. And I remember, I was, you know, early 90s, and I remember being a young teenager watching those images, and, you know, those people, and goes to the other thing. It's like, when we see people who look like us, it tends to hit us more impactfully, I guess. And that's a terrible thing, but we do that as human beings, you know. But as a kid, it looked like Ireland, you know, parts of it where they were moving. I just remember this image of this, you know, group of people all on a road carrying their belongings. And I remember thinking, like, where would we go? Like, what would we do? And I grew up with, you know, it wasn't a war, but it was a terrorist, the trouble, you know, it was a conflict. And so that kind of idea that things could get worse, or I think that was always sort of there in the back of your head. And especially when, you know, I grew up used to seeing armies and tanks and you know, border controls and going through checkpoints and things like that all my life. So I'm kind of losing my train of thought. Oh yeah, so this idea that I think a lot of us live in these sort of privileged bubbles where we think, you know, it could never happen to us, and that would never happen in America, or that would never happen in the UK, or, you know, it could at any moment. We don't know. And then maybe we'll be those people putting our hands out looking for help. I think people should always remember that. Okay. Sometimes I get a bit soapboxy. So she asked about the vignettes or segues into other worlds, in The Man in Tokyo or The Man in Australia. And we never meet these characters again. And what did I think of the purpose of that device? And that actually feeds very well into the next bit I'm going to read. Well, I think that again sort of shows that Hamid, he could have followed any one of those stories. That the story of the struggle and the story of why people move, what they're looking for, we all there's a universality to what we as human beings want and need, and that stability in our lives, to be safe, to feel like we can take care of ourselves and take care of our families. And that's very basic human nature. And I think that, we stuck with Saeed and Nadia, but you could go to any country and find people who are in a very similar, obviously unique to them, but similar position and similar journey. But we'll go and we'll read the bit with the woman in Palo Alto, because I also, I loved this. It's in a different way, it's a very different way of looking at how things are in constant shift and motion. And again, it's sort of about that permission and like what's a respectable migration and what's not, and what kind of migration do we, this influx of wealthy people into Silicon Valley and taking over that's okay. But this influx of people who are from a struggling place, who are trying to find a better life, that's not. And the arbitrary sort of nature of who gets to decide that and why. Anyway, let's read it. Not far to the south, in the town of Palo Alto, lived an old woman who lived in the same house her entire life. Her parents had brought her to this house when she was born, and her mother had passed on there while she was a teenager, and her father when she was in her 20s, and her husband had joined her there, and her 2 children had grown up in this house, and she had lived alone with them when she divorced, and later with her second husband, their stepfather, and her children had moved off to college and not returned, and her second husband had died 2 years ago, and throughout this time she had never moved. Travelled, yes, but never moved, and yet it seemed the world had moved, and she barely recognised the town that existed outside her property. The old woman had become a rich woman on paper. The house was now worth a fortune, and her children were always pestering her to sell it, saying she didn't need all that space, but she told them to be patient. It would be theirs when she died. To sharpen, and she said this kindly, to sharpen the bite of it, and to remind them how much they were motivated by money they spent without having, which she had never done, always saving for a rainy day, even if only a little. One of her granddaughters went to the great... Mama, good. Let's try it again. Somebody says turn off the comments. How do I do that? Nope. I don't know how to do that at the moment. I'm sorry. Somebody's going to have to explain to me how to do that. Turned off the comments. Let's see if this is going to help. A university that had gone from being a local secret to among the world's most famous in the space of the old woman's lifetime. This granddaughter came to see her often as much as once a week. She was the only one of the old woman's descendants who did this, and I thought that was going to help. Also sometimes felt baffled by her. Looking at her granddaughter, she thought, had she been born in China? For the granddaughter had features of the old woman, and yet looked to the old woman overall more or less, but mostly more Chinese. There was a rise that led up to the old woman's street, and when she was a little girl, the old woman used to push her bike up and then get on and zoom back down without pedalling, bikes being heavy in these days and hard to take uphill, especially when you were small, and she was then. She had liked to see how far she could glide without stopping, flashing through the intersections, ready to brake, but not overly ready because there had been a lot less traffic, at least as far as she could remember. She always had a carp in a mossy pond in the back of her house, carp that her granddaughter called goldfish, and she had known the names of almost everyone on her street, and most had been there a long time, since they were old California, from families that were California families. But over the years they had changed more and more rapidly, and now she knew none of them, and saw no reason to make the effort, for people bought and sold houses the way they bought and sold old socks. And every year someone was moving out and someone was moving in, And now all these doors from who knows where were opening, and all sorts of strange people were around, people who looked more at home than she was, even the homeless ones who spoke no English, more at home maybe because they were younger. And when she went out, it seemed to her that she too had migrated, that everyone migrates, even if we stay in the same houses our whole lives, because we can't help it. We are all migrants through time. I love that. Very quickly, because we're almost an hour in, and this connection is also driving me and probably everyone scatty. Someone asked how I felt about the book ending, and I loved it. I think this idea of going back, I know that feeling of going back to where you grew up and it looking so different, and you feeling almost as much of a stranger there as you do anywhere else, but yet there's still that connection. So it's in the same sense, feel at home and yet a stranger. But it was beautiful to see Saeed and Nadia come together as old friends and reminisce in a way and remember beautiful things about each other. So to finish, I'm going to read one last passage that I this is from Beth Rogie. Sorry, I can't even read my own handwriting. We are all children who lose our parents, all of us, every man and woman and boy and girl, and we too will all be lost by those who come after us and love us. And this loss unites humanity, unites every human being, the temporary nature of our beingness and our shared sorrow, the heartache we each carry and yet too often refuse to acknowledge in one another. Saeed felt it might be possible in the face of death to believe in humanity's potential for building a better world, and so he prayed as a lament, as a consolation, as a hope. Beth wanted to know why Saeed could find hope, and if I thought it was faith and belief in something bigger, greater. I'm not a religious person, but I definitely think I'm a spiritual person. And I wanted to end this on a little hopeful note and say that faith doesn't have to be religious. And yes, I do believe that we have to believe in the greater good of humanity. And that, as much as there are horrific problems all over the world, now my alarm's going off. As much as there are horrific problems over the world, we do seem to be on a trajectory where, as long as we don't ruin everything with a lack of action with climate crisis, things do seem to progressively get better, and it's not a linear line. It's not a straight trajectory, but I don't know. I think we all have to have a little faith that, there's beauty in everything in the world. And so we'll end it. We'll end our chat on that. But I need to tell you what the book is for the next one. And this has, I'm trying to connect the books. And actually there was a section I was going to talk about why that book connected with the last book, but we sort of ran out of time. But I'm going with a South American writer. We are going with Isabel Allende. And I've chosen her book, The Japanese Lover. It's probably back to front to everybody. I haven't gotten my book yet because everything's delayed over here because COVID and Christmas. But it's a love story, and it's also about people traveling across the world, and that's about as much as I know, because you know what I love to do and read nothing about the books I'm choosing. But I'll turn the comments back on, by the way, just now, just to say hi to a few people. Maybe that was a bad idea. Yeah, I'm excited. We will choose a date sort of late January. Obviously Christmas, people are going to be very busy. I start back at Outlander very soon, but we will go for the end of January. And before this bloody connection gets any worse, I'm going to say thank you so much, everybody. Have an amazing holidays, whatever you celebrate. I wish I wish you all a very safe and healthy and happy holidays. So sending love to everybody. Goodbye.